So in this video we're going to talk about the Mighty compressor, which is an absolute hand grenade and can completely pulverise anything you put into it in a good way, of course. It's a very simple set of controls. Again, we've got the parallel path, we've got all the sidechain features, everything that we've got with all of the other compressors in the Allen and Heath range. Three main controls on this. Threshold, we've got a release control, which is where the fun lies with this compressor, as you'll hear when we start putting some drums through it. Output control, which you'll probably use a little bit less on this compressor than other compressors, because this tends to act like an AGC compressor, meaning that the more compression you put in, you won't actually lose any volume on the back end of the compressor. So you can see that we'll kind of constantly be in 20 or 30 dB of gain reduction on this compressor, which sounds a lot, but it's where it likes to sit. And the actual output signal of the compressor won't get any quieter. So you know, the output control is there to be used should you need to, but for the most part you probably won't need to. We've got no ratio control on this. It's a fixed ratio compressor. As you'll hear, it's a pretty savage ratio. And then the detector control, changing this between peak and average. Peak obviously being a much faster attack, so again, taking that kind of front end off the drums or something like that. Average makes it into a much more RMS kind of compressor where it's going to be a lot more flowing. It wants to hurt things. It wants to be really aggressive, this compressor. Things like drum loops or any kind of stuff where you've got transient stuff and you really want to, as I say, dial in that kind of release control, that nice fast release, and you can get the really old school kind of aggressive pumping sound. You can really, in the studio especially, you know, if you're mixing any recorded content, I think being able to bring out the room mic and the tail end of things, this compressor really will transform how things sound. It really is a creative tool rather than a kind of utility compressor. So I'm going to show you on snare drums. It's not actually part of this mix, but before we go on to what I'm using it on, I actually really want to show you what it can do to drums, because like we said, this thing really can completely and utterly transform the sound of things. So let's just listen to the flat snare drum without anything on it. And then we're going to bring in the Mighty just with the settings straight out the box, and you'll hear instantly it's absolutely welting the snare drum, completely and utterly changed the sound of it. Again, we've got that really nice extension at the kind of back end of the sound. To be honest, even at that setting, if we bring in the parallel path and we bring some of the original snare drum back in, actually it's a really nice snare drum sound straight away, giving it a ton more life. But we'll get rid of the parallel path. So that's on an average setting with the detector. If we go into peak, you'll hear it speeds up the attack, and actually almost the snare drum almost completely disappears when we're down in 20 dB gain reduction. So if we dial that threshold off, again we'll keep the peaking because I liked what it was doing to the front end, and we'll just start to dial it in. Again, like I said earlier, you can see more and more gain reduction, but we're not actually getting any quieter. So we've still got that output control here, but normally you'd expect that when we're in 20 dB gain reduction, that obviously your sound is a hell of a lot quieter than it was to start with. So it's quite interesting, this, because you can really start to throw it in and not have to solo things or stick your headphones on. You know, you can throw this guy on in a mix and start to dial things in and really hear sonically how it's changing things, but it's not going to drop out the mix. So it's a nice one to have a play with. But going back to what was said about the release control, let's get pretty aggressive amount of compression on this. So we're down at -15 there again without. You can hear we're hitting it really hard. Now the fun part of this compressor is the release control. I'm going to speed this up and listen what it does. You instantly hear how you really get that kind of swell after the initial transient, and the more that we dial this in, listen to that kind of really nice, it's bringing out the tone of the snare drum. It's bringing in a little bit more hi-hats than we would like. You know, we're being a little bit extreme here, but again, if we back off that threshold without, we've got that really almost lifeless, you know, almost lifeless snare drum sound. The second we start to bring this in, you just start to hear it really excites the back end of the sound. And again, then we can lean on this parallel path and we can start bringing that front end back in. And the difference without and with, it completely changes the snare drum sound. So the other thing that we can do as well, we can get rid of that parallel path and we can go to the average detector, which again just slows that attack time down. That's just naturally letting a bit more front end of the drum through. So then we can start getting a bit more aggressive. Slow the release time down a little bit, and you can hear the difference. We'll go really extreme with the release time. And again, the snare drum almost disappears. So it's just kind of fine tuning that release time. So somewhere there for me, kind of about 0.1 is working really well. I love what that's doing to the snare drum. From a kind of boring sound to really hitting it hard. And then again, we're bringing that parallel path, bring that kind of front end back. And the difference without, pretty boring, nondescript. As soon as I put it in, I've got this really big fat snare drum, which in the mix, so again, we'll bypass it, and then in. So you can hear it's giving me that really big, fat, over-the-top snare drum sound, which this compressor is really, really great for that. As I say, you know, if you get a chance to use it on some stuff that's been recorded in a studio, room mics and things like that, anything where you can really start to shape that kind of back end and you can really start to bring out some amazing natural reverbs and stuff like that. But it really does completely and utterly change the sound of things. Going to the complete other end of the spectrum is I love this thing on guitars, and it's more a kind of tonal thing. What it does, if you kind of imagine a sound wave, you've got all your peaks and troughs and everything like that. This guy obviously aggressively squashes them down, but tonally it seems to just kind of almost do the same thing as like a you know, like a overdriven tube kind of stage or something like that, or a kind of saturation thing, and it kind of seems to like tonally fill the gaps. So I'm using this guy on guitars, and again, not a huge amount of compression. Listen to the guitar sound without. And as soon as we put it in, you can hear again, it's not really changing the levels, it's not really changing any of the initial attack of what he's playing, but it just all of a sudden brings a little bit of more bottom end in the guitar sound, and it just seems to it's like I've saturated a little bit more. You know, we're not in a huge amount of compression. I've slowed down the release time on this because I don't want it to pump. So I'm actually using the release time to just kind of hold it in compression. And again, you can just instantly hear the difference of how it just really fattens out the guitar sound. So I'm not using it as you would expect to use a compressor, where I'm using it to hold down peaks or whatever. You know, I'm actually using this to completely change the sound, and it's like I've got, you know, my guitar sound here, and everything that's kind of underneath and falling away is just being brought up, and is just really kind of fattening the guitar sound, and again keeping everything really pinned. So the difference this thing makes on guitars is absolutely amazing. So on this, I've not got a lot of guitars. I've just got two guys playing. I've got a dynamic and a condenser mic on each of the guitars. I've got Mighty on every single one of those. So if we just listen to the guitars on their own, you can instantly hear they're just held in place. So for that kind of big forward modern rock mix that I'm after, it just gives me this big wall of guitars. And if we put everything else in, you can just hear what it's doing with this kind of chuggy guitar, this guy here. I'm not getting any nasty swells. Again, you can hear all the articulation, you can get everything he's playing, but it's holding it where I want. And then with the lead stuff again, it's holding him down, which then just gives me so much more control when I want to decide where I want to place him in the mix. And I can really kind of lean into the guitars, and it just again gives me that really big fat sound. So again, not somewhere where you think about using that compressor, you know, the most people would reach to that and throw it straight on drums because of that kind of release control and how you can really massively change the sound of drums. And this thing really will make you rethink how you use compression. It's not just a standard compressor that you're going to use to just control levels. You know, there's other things that will do that, not better, but will get you what you want if you're approaching it that way. This thing is really it's an instrument more than anything else. It's an effect. It's really going to change how things sound. But yeah, we'd love to know what you guys are using it on, and enjoy. Cheers.